Right, guys. So apologies, we're just a minute or two late there starting. So I suppose we'll kick off straight away in the interest of time. But I suppose just to start off, you're very welcome to this webinar this morning. And just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Melissa Mooney, and I'm project coordinator on Rangam's team in Europe, or EMEA. For those of you who mightn't have heard of Rangam before, we're a workforce solutions company and we work with companies globally to help neurodivergent or disabled job seekers find work that is, I suppose, truly inclusive and accessible. And I suppose I'll get into a little bit more detail towards the end about what we can do for you as a candidate, particularly around today's topic and disclosure. So do stick around for that. But I suppose in the interest of time, I think we'll just get straight stuck into today's topic, which is navigating disclosure in the world of work. And also just a quick bit of housekeeping before we start. This is obviously a massive topic that I'd happily talk about all morning. So really we will only be skimming the surface really for the next 20 minutes or 25 minutes or so this morning. So if you guys would be interested in a follow-up webinar on this topic, or even if you have any more questions, just drop this into the chat and my colleague Emma is there to answer, and we'd also be delighted to answer any questions if there's time at the end. So I'm just going to plow through the content for the next 20-25 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. So please do leave anything, questions, comments, thoughts, etc. into the chat as I'm speaking, and I will circle back to them at the end. So with no further ado, I think let's begin. Just a quick breakdown of what we're covering today. Being autistic myself, I'm quite a logical thinker, and I know disclosure can be a pretty abstract topic. So I think a really nice way of breaking it down is according to the what, the who, the why, the when, the what, and the what next of disclosure. That's probably going to seem a bit confusing to you right now, but I promise it will make more sense as we go along. So I suppose with that, we'll start with the what. In other words, what exactly is disclosure? So, of course, disclosing your disability isn't something that's just confined to the world of work, and it's also something you can do in your personal life, of course, whether that's, disclosing to a friend or a family member. But I suppose in the context of work, disclosure is essentially just letting someone know that you have a disability or are neurodivergent. This can be in a formal setting where you've set up a meeting with someone specifically to discuss this and how it impacts you at work. Or it can be something that you're just casually dropping into a conversation just because you feel like it's something that you want that person to know and understand when they work with you. But I suppose generally the idea, or I suppose the impetus behind someone deciding to disclose, is the desire for supports or reasonable accommodations from your employer. So ultimately you can be set up to succeed in your role and in your team. And I suppose that brings us to the next question, which is who can disclose? I mean, that might sound like a bit of an obvious question, but it's maybe not as clear-cut as you think. Like essentially anyone with a disability, neurodivergence or mental health condition can disclose that they have said condition to their employer. And again, that might sound obvious, but I think maybe a common misunderstanding is that you have to have a formal diagnosis to disclose. That's not necessarily the case. Even if you're a self-identified neurodivergent person, whether that's autism, ADHD, or anything along those lines, this is also valid and you're absolutely entitled to disclose this to your employer and ask for support, even if you haven't got a piece of paper to prove it. In fact, in the UK, there is the Disability Discrimination Act, which explicitly protects workers with disabilities from discrimination by their employers. So I suppose as a result of that, an employer can't dismiss you after you disclose your disability to them. Employers are also obliged to provide you with reasonable accommodations, and failing to do so is technically a breach of the Act. Now, I'm not an expert on that, as you can probably tell from my accent. I don't live in the UK, so I'm sure Emma would be happy to clarify any questions you might have about that and knowing your rights in the chat. So feel free to ask away about that. But I suppose just moving on, a question that does crop up a lot when it comes to disclosure is who exactly should you disclose to? And there's no one correct answer here. Essentially, the answer is just whoever you feel comfortable with. It all very much depends on your own individual comfort levels, with who in your organization you would want to know about your disability, and I suppose just who you feel would benefit from knowing about it is the most important question to ask yourself. But in terms of people that you could disclose to, I think this could be anyone, obviously, but the person who probably benefits most from this information is your manager. Mostly because they're best placed to implement the reasonable accommodations that you would need to succeed in your role. But I suppose also advocate for you at a HR level in terms of making your role as accessible as possible for you. You can also, I suppose, cut out the middleman in that sense and disclose to a member of like your company's human resources team yourself, just directly. If they don't already have this information on their system from you disclosing during the recruitment process, they could benefit from this information in terms of ensuring that you have the adaptations in place that you need. You can obviously disclose to other teammates or even someone you work with closely outside of your team. If it helps them understand how you work best and you're comfortable doing so, then absolutely go for it. Speaking from my own experience as an autistic person, the amount of people that I disclosed to definitely grew from employer to employer as I got more comfortable with sharing this information with people. And I could definitely see that it was being received well by those I did choose to share it with. So I suppose I just grew in confidence. And I suppose over time, I found I was just casually dropping it into conversations sometimes without even realizing it. And I just find that, if I'm working with someone on a project, that they really do benefit from knowing how I work best. But having said that, if you're not quite there yet, or you're just not comfortable disclosing to people outside of, I suppose, a need to know basis, that's also completely okay. You're under absolutely no obligation. It's worth just, I suppose, keeping in mind that there are other ways that you can still have this conversation with people outside of your team without having to explicitly disclose to them that you have some form of disability or are neurodivergent. For example, if I'm working with someone on a cross-functional project, I could simply say to them, look, I really like structure. I'm a visual thinker. So could we just map this project out so I can understand exactly what my role in this is going to be? I'd also like any instructions to be given to me in writing, because this is just the way I work best. So I would just appreciate if we could, I suppose, work in this way. That's the exact same conversation that you would have, just without the part where I actually say I'm autistic. And there's absolutely nothing unreasonable about framing it that way either. So every single person in the workplace, regardless of whether you're disabled or not, will have a particular preference for how they work best. So you asking up front for the things that you need to make your role a success is a perfectly okay thing to do. So don't feel that you can't, I suppose, articulate that to the people that you're working with, even if you don't want to go quite as far as sharing personal information about yourself or your disability to every Tom, Dick and Harry in your organization. You don't have to go quite that far, but that doesn't mean that you can't state your needs without having to frame it in the context of having a disability. Sometimes it is kind of good to give them that added context, but all within your comfort levels, of course. And I suppose that's actually a nice enough segue into the why of disclosure. In other words, why would I bother disclose to anyone in the first place? What's in it for me? What's in it for them? But as I mentioned earlier, the main benefit of disclosure really is, of course, the secured accommodations and adjustments that you need to make the best possible stab at your role. But I suppose some less obvious reasons are that explaining in advance how your neurodivergence or disability impacts you at work can actually often lead to better understanding amongst your team. And I suppose more importantly, can help prevent misunderstandings. For example, I suppose if you're autistic like myself, and if you maybe sometimes struggle with things like executive dysfunction, to someone who isn't familiar with autism, that can, from the outside in, look like maybe you're being lazy or unproductive, which obviously isn't the case at all. That, I suppose that's how it looks when they don't have that context. Whereas if your manager knows about your neurodivergence and how it impacts you, you guys are empowered to work together to, I suppose, explore strategies that will help you navigate some of the barriers that you might face, and I suppose how to circumvent them. And it goes without saying, but ultimately the big plus of disclosure is that it empowers you to, I suppose, not hide away certain aspects of who you are in order to fit into the organization. And it enables you to bring your whole self to work, not just the parts that align with your team's ways of thinking and ways of working, but a version of you that's actually authentic and true to yourself. And that's the big win, I suppose, that is to be taken away from disclosure. I mean, speaking from my own experience, it does feel like a weight lifted, and more than anything, I've always just felt relieved afterwards. That I won't have to go into this role masking the things I struggle with or mightn't make much sense to my team. And instead that we're just having this open dialogue about how to set things up in a way that clicks with me. So I suppose that is kind of an overview of the benefits. There's probably plenty more I haven't mentioned, but I suppose that just takes us on then to the whole process of evaluating when you feel most comfortable disclosing. And that is a big question, actually, the when, and it's one that's worth a lot of consideration. I suppose when you're evaluating when to disclose, whether it's during the recruitment process or maybe once you're in the role, something that might help you as a starting point and maybe put you at ease is to do some research into the employer to see how inclusive they at least appear to be on the outside. So I would recommend having a look at the company's website to see if they're disability confident, which is a scheme that employers can sign up for to show that they're, I suppose, committed to disability inclusion. There's a whole pile of assessments involved in it. So I suppose they have to really walk the walk and talk as well as talk the talk. So if they have that, that's usually a green flag. Or if they have an employee resource group that focuses specifically on disability, that's another good thing to look out for. Maybe see if there's anything on the website or even on the job ad itself about the employer's commitment to disability inclusion. Again, you don't have to do that, but it might just, I suppose, help you figure out if and when you feel comfortable disclosing. I mean, first off, there's nothing stopping you from disclosing your neurodivergence or disability, whatever it is, as soon as you apply for the role at the earliest opportunity. Generally, on an online application form, there should be a box to tick where you can declare your disability or request any reasonable adjustments that you might need for your interview. Most forms should have some version of that nowadays, you would hope. But even if there isn't, there should at least be a free text box where you can add anything else you'd like the employer to know, which is usually towards the bottom of the form, so keep an eye out for that as well. If neither of these are there on the form and you don't see the opportunity to disclose on the form itself, there should be contact details for the employer either on the form or on the job ad for you to reach out with any questions. So if you do want to disclose straight away, I'd encourage you to reach out and disclose that way, I suppose, if you feel comfortable. The benefit, I suppose, of disclosing as early as you can is that you can request obviously reasonable accommodations for your interview. And the sooner that you make the employer aware of your disability, the sooner they have the information that they need to make the job interview or any other assessments that are part of the process as accessible to your individual needs as possible. And, set yourself up ultimately for success in the recruitment process. If you'd feel more comfortable, I suppose, sussing out the employer first and waiting until your interview to make the call on whether you want to disclose or not, that's obviously completely valid and is another stage in the process where you should have that opportunity to let the employer know that you're autistic or neurodivergent, whatever it is. Almost any interview should conclude with the interviewer flipping the script and asking if you've got any questions for them. So I would say this is usually a good point to bring it up organically. The downside to waiting until that point, I would say, is you obviously wouldn't have any reasonable accommodations for the interview because they're not aware that you need them. But I suppose if you're okay with that, or interviews are something that you feel confident with anyway, then you're absolutely free to make that call to disclose at a later stage. It's all down to your comfort levels. But I suppose you just have to be okay with not having the accommodations if you wait until then. And obviously, you can, of course, wait until you're already in the role and have gotten to know your manager and your team. Again, the sooner the employer knows that you need the additional support, the sooner that they can get those supports in place for you. So if you reach out with, your disclosure as soon as you get the job offer, You might actually be able to get some support for your onboarding process. So that might be some support maybe with the admin and paperwork required to get everything set up, or even support with your induction and orientation into the company. If you decide to wait until you're already started in your role, the way I'd advise you to approach it is to request a one-to-one meeting with your manager and to block off some time to, I suppose, have an actual proper discussion of your disability, how it impacts you at work, what supports you might need, and I suppose where to go from there. It's also pretty likely that your manager will schedule a meeting to make introductions, either before you start your role or shortly after you start. So this can be a good space as well to gauge the situation and, I suppose, mention your disability to them without having to proactively schedule a meeting with them yourself. But sometimes it's good to just set aside some time specifically to discuss it and give it the time it deserves. Again, like I said, the earlier the better is a good rule of thumb, but ultimately there is no right or wrong answer, and you should be, go with your gut ultimately and stick to whatever you feel comfortable with. I think, like, speaking from my own experience, I started out earlier in my career maybe a bit more hesitant to disclose, but then I suppose as I did start disclosing, I thankfully always had good experiences where managers didn't necessarily know anything about autism, but they received the information positively and were willing to work with me to actually understand what my individual access needs are and find a way of working that actually works for me. So I suppose because I was encouraged by those experiences, my confidence in disclosing as early as possible in the recruitment process really grew. I mean, when I first started out in my career, companies were only just starting to take a more widespread interest in neurodiversity, and I suppose the general discourse around autism at the time wasn't quite as strengths-based as it is today. So I was maybe a bit more, like I said, reticent to disclose early in the recruitment process because I didn't necessarily, I'd maybe internalize this narrative that autism isn't a great asset in my career that I see it as today. So like I was definitely a bit more cautious about disclosing before I'd been hired. I think there were two sides to my apprehension. So on the one hand, I was of course afraid of, discrimination, or that the employer would, I suppose, negate all my strengths as soon as they heard about my diagnosis and it wouldn't matter what I'd say. But then on the other hand, I was also afraid of being the diversity hire and I suppose suffering from imposter syndrome in the role where I'm not sure whether I got in because I'm the best of what they saw that day or because I look good in their diversity stats. But I think as time went on, I ended up debunking a lot of these fears by doing what I do best as an autistic person, which is to, I suppose, rationalize and think logically about what's actually behind these fears. So I suppose take my first concern that I had about discrimination. Yes, it's really bad in this day and age that there are still some employers who maybe have negatively skewed views of neurodiversity and aren't quite on board yet with all the untapped strengths that we bring to the table. But you know what? If they were biased and misguided enough to, think that you being neurodivergent is going to be an issue for them, then the chances are that they weren't going to provide a good supportive working environment for you anyway, even if you hadn't disclosed, and they'd end up getting the job. So you probably would have ended up feeling burnt out and unvalued in that company anyway if that was the attitude taken. So, and personally, I think you're worth a lot more than that. So if you do suspect that maybe your disclosure led to some bias or ableism on the part of the employer, which thankfully I think is actually becoming a much less frequent occurrence in recent years based on, anecdotes I've heard myself, I would encourage you to reframe it, not as a rejection or an indictment on your character, but instead as a really good litmus test for understanding whether an employer is prepared to support you as you deserve to be supported. And in terms of my other concern about being a diversity hire, what I say to that is even if this is true, which is probably not, but let's just assume it is for argument's sake, you wouldn't have put yourself forward for this role if you didn't think you were capable of doing a great job at it. So whatever your employer's motivations may or may not have been, that doesn't change the fact that you got the job and you can do a great job with it. So ultimately, nothing else matters other than that. Who cares what anyone else thinks? Just go ahead and ace the role like you can, and cast any doubts of that nature out of your mind. So when I started seeing it this way, my confidence in interview situations grew in leaps and bounds. And so whatever niggling doubts that you might have in your mind about how your disclosure may positively or negatively impact your chances of getting a job, I'd encourage you to break them down like this. And I suppose suddenly they lose a lot of the power that they have over you, and you feel empowered to do the best you can in the recruitment process. And I suppose with that, that brings us to the most important question of all, which is what next? Disclosure, I suppose, in of itself doesn't really mean anything if you think about it. It's what action comes of it that gives disclosure its meaning and its purpose in the workplace. So it's really important that this initial conversation that you have, whether it's with your manager, your HR, or your wider team, whoever you choose to tell, is just a starting point for an ongoing conversation and dialogue that's constantly revisited and adjusted as you progress through the company or throughout your career in general, or anywhere else you might end up in your career, even if that means you have a different manager or you're not in the same company anymore. This is all information that you can transfer over to wherever you end up in your career. I'd encourage you to schedule in quarterly or even monthly reviews of how things are going for you, what reasonable accommodations have been working well for you, what ones haven't, what different approaches could be taken to make your role as accessible to you as possible, and maybe just revisiting things to see if there's ways we can make it even better for you. It's always a work in progress as your role evolves. So, I mean, as for example, as you get promoted, as maybe you move laterally across the company and your role evolves, so will the accommodations that you'll likely need to bring your full potential to the role. So I think the most crucial thing I'll say to you this morning is once you do disclose, keep that conversation going. That is absolutely critical to ensuring the success of the accommodations that really set you up to thrive in your role. It's worth bearing in mind as well that in the UK, roughly 20% of the population has some form of a disability. That's 1 in 5 people, which is not an insignificant amount of people whatsoever. So if you're nervous about having the conversation or have any inhibitions at all about disclosing, just know that you're far from the only one who has a disability, and even within your workplace, whether the employer realizes it or not. And ultimately, you deserve to be supported and to feel a sense of belonging to your place of work as much as anyone else on your team. So at the same time, I don't want to act as though disclosure isn't sometimes intimidating. It absolutely can be. But I suppose this is just one of many things that we can actually help you with through our Sourceable program here at Wrangham, which I want to kind of briefly take you through. So if you're one of our candidates and you sign up with us as a candidate, we can help link you up to employers that we work with very closely, and we therefore know are genuinely interested in ensuring that anyone who joins their organization who's neurodivergent, autistic, disabled, whatever it is, has everything they need to thrive in the workplace, and therefore, I suppose, actively welcomes you to disclose your disability to them. And there's no fear of judgment. They want to understand you and the ways that you work best. When you sign up with us, we're with you every step of the way. You get one-on-one time with a member of our team. We really take the time to get to know you and build a really detailed profile of your strengths, your interests, what you're looking for in your next role, and I suppose the skill set that you have to apply to this role. If we see a role then that comes up with one of our partner employers, it's a good match for you. With your permission, we'll put you forward for the role. And obviously, again, only with your permission, we'll disclose to the hiring manager on your behalf as we work closely with them to ensure that you get the accommodations that are tailored to your individual needs for your job interview. And also to ensure that, just in general, that you have everything you need to shine in your interview, because ultimately our partner employers want you to succeed as much as we do. Should you secure a role with one of our partner employers, we remain with you as you navigate the conversation around disclosure and reasonable accommodations. Our support continues right through to onboarding and in-role support, and we ensure that both our partner employer and yourself have everything you need to set yourself up for success in your new role, particularly support for yourself in getting comfortable in the role and ensuring that your manager has an understanding of how to tailor your role to your individual access needs. So, we offer, I suppose, a great deal of support to yourself in ensuring that you feel confident navigating the workplace as an autistic neurodivergent. or disabled candidate. But most importantly, by signing up with us, you get access to our network of employers who are really passionate about disability inclusion and want to hire you not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes great business sense to bring all these insights that have been, I suppose, unfairly shut out for quite some time into the workforce. I have a little slide there that shows you how to get in touch with us. If you'd move on to the next slide, please. And so you can register with us if you're in the UK at www.sourceable.co.uk. If you're in Ireland, you can go to www.sourceable.ie. And if you've got any questions after today, if there's maybe anything you'd like me to clarify, you can get in touch as well through inquiries at sourceable.co.uk. And you can obviously give us a follow on LinkedIn. We have more webinars coming up this month. I think next week we're talking about how to ace your job interview, and the week after that we're going to be talking about reasonable adjustments, of course, the age-old topic. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today and found it educational, informative. If there's any questions, drop them into the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. But otherwise, do get in touch, do sign up, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.